and institutions. It is Thursday, April, I was going to say March,
Nope.
April 3rd. And we're picking up this afternoon on the House Bill 191, which deals with restricting any out-of-state beds being used to house our Vermont correctional incarcerated folks. So we have our legal counsel here to walk us through the bill. So it's really important to have the bill in front of you. And Ben, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Maybe share my screen.
Oh,
Good afternoon, House Corrections and Institutions Committee. It's been a while. If you remember, my name is Ben Nowstrowski from the Office of Legislative Counsel. Before the committee it's H-191, my mistake from before, which is entitled a bill or an act relating to prohibiting the use of private and for-profit correctional facilities. So what this bill in general proposes to do is restrict the Commissioner of Corrections authority to assign and transfer persons in the custody of DOC by only permitting the assignment and transfer of those persons to facilities operated by public or nonprofit entities and pursuant to an interstate or federal contract. The bill further proposes that DOC create an implementation plan to repatriate incarcerated individuals housed out of state back to Vermont. Any questions on the general concept of the bill before we get into the details? Section 1 is a findings and intent section. So subsection A states that the General Assembly finds that the population of inmates in Vermont has risen from approximately 300 detainees per day in 2020 to approximately 500 detainees per day in 2024, while the sentence population has remained relatively stable during the same time period. In subdivision 2, it states that housing individuals in an out-of-state correctional facility is not a temporary solution and results in a long-term, costly, and unsustainable practice for the state. Moving on to stating that sending individuals out of state discourages visits from family and friends. Studies have shown a correlation between visitation and reduced recidivism upon completion of prison time. Incarcerated individuals housed out of state have restricted access to legal counsel, resulting in an increased reliance on telecommunication. This additional burden subjects prisoners and those who wish to contact them to exorbitant correctional facility phone rates. The state is unable to provide the same level of oversight and care for incarcerated individuals held at out-of-state correctional facilities. And finally, in subsection B, it is the intent of the General Assembly that by 2034, Vermont's practice of housing incarcerated individuals in privately operated for-profit or out-of-state correctional facilities shall be prohibited so that corporations are not enriched for depriving the liberty of persons sentenced to imprisonment. It is the further intent of the General Assembly that such a prohibition does not affect incarcerated individuals housed in a facility pursuant to an interstate compact. So that is the general intent of the bill.
So Ben, for intent language, does that go in the green books or not?
So in this one, the way it's designed is that it would not. This would go in as the bill into the session law. This wouldn't be codified. And again, the import of an intent section does not have the same force and effect of law. It is purely an expression of the legislature's intent for the bill itself.
More of a statement.
Precisely.
Okay. So it doesn't make or break the bill.
Correct.
Just kind of lays the foundation.
But moving to the substance of the bill, beginning in section 2, this amends section 102 of Title 28, which concerns the Commissioner of Corrections powers and responsibilities. You'll see just some technical corrections in subdivision 4, but you'll also see in subdivision 5 that part of his responsibilities is to order the assignment and transfer of persons committed to the custody of the commissioner to correctional facilities, including out-of-state facilities. And this bill adds the language that to correctional facilities, provided the facilities are operated by a public or nonprofit entity including out-of-state facilities.
So that's our limitation to public or nonprofit. That's where you prohibit the use of out-of-state beds in a for-profit facility.
Yes. Under subsection C of the same section of law, this goes into the commissioner's responsibilities. Again, you'll see some just some technical corrections and updates there. However, in subdivision 20, which is on the following page, you'll see that the commissioner's responsibilities include the ability to utilize BGS's competitive bidding process in order to determine the most effective and cost-effective alternatives for housing inmates placed in any out-of-state correctional facility pursuant to an interstate compact or federal contract. So what that would permit is that it would permit the transfer to those out-of-state facilities only if they're part of an interstate or federal compact, essentially.
Would they be a private facility?
Not read in conjunction with the other limitation that I went through here.
In section 4.
Well, and also
Five.
in subdivision 5 on the previous page.
Just to help committee see how the two pieces are interrelated. Because it's all under section 102, which is the powers and duties of the commission. So on page 3, number 5, it's very clear that the commissioner would not be able to enter into a contract or place incarcerated folks in a facility that was operated by a private entity.
And I do have to say, I don't know, I don't have intimate knowledge of what's contained in any interstate compact or federal contract that DOC currently has. It may include sort of a pre-selected site based off of those contracts. So how effective this would be, I think, is a good question for the department about how those contracts are formed and whether or not they actually engage in bidding processes in the formation of those contracts or compacts.
Questions on this one?
No.
Okay. Moving on to section 3. So this adds a new section of law to Title 28, Section 709, which creates certain prohibitions for out-of-state facilities. So in subsection A, there are general facility prohibitions that no individual under the custody of the commissioner shall be supervised, housed, treated, or cared for in an out-of-state correctional facility unless it is operated by a public or nonprofit entity to house individuals pursuant to an interstate compact or federal contract. Subdivision 2 reads that the department shall not employ any rehabilitative, educational, healthcare, or other support services provided by a private or for-profit entity. The department shall not contract with any private or for-profit entity to operate any correctional facility. Subsection B gets into transfer prohibitions. So the transfer of inmates or detainees or offenders between facilities. So on and after July 1st of 2025, so this year, the commissioner shall neither negotiate nor execute contracts for the assignment or transfer of individuals to an out-of-state correctional facility unless the facility is operated by a public or nonprofit entity to house individuals pursuant to an interstate compact or federal contract. So that joins those concepts together, that basically they cannot be transferred out of state to any facility unless it's operated by a nonprofit or public agency and it's part of a compact or contract. And then finally, in subdivision 2, on and after July 1st of 2030, the commissioner shall terminate or amend any existing contracts to be compliant with this section. So it gives some lead time. Any questions on section 3?
We currently do have interstate compacts.
From my knowledge, we do.
That we can ship folks back and forth for a variety of reasons, and DOC can explain why.
So going on to section 4, This creates an implementation plan for this prohibition that we've outlined. So on or before November 15th of 2025, so later this year, DOC shall develop and submit a written plan to the Senate Committees on Institutions and on Judiciary and the House Committee on Corrections and Institutions, detailing an implementation plan for the following. 1, the expansion of in-state capacity for facilities operated by DOC with the objective of leveraging restorative justice approaches, pre- and post-charge diversion, and rehabilitative programming to achieve such capacity expansion. And 2, transferring individuals currently housed in out-of-state facilities back to Vermont in accordance with the timelines described in 28 VSA 709 sub B. And then finally, section 5, the act takes effect on passage.
Comments?
Bill, about the bill, I got.
Would you like me to leave this on the screen while we discuss?
So we'll go to Will, Sean, James,
Also
and
go.
Troy.
I'm going first.
You had your hand up.
I thought they raised theirs first, so
Oh, I
I'm
saw
fine.
you first.
Well, so I guess, I mean, I just kind of wanted to speak more to a question I had about the compacts. Do you know if you could get us a list of all the different compacts that we have for them? Maybe
We
that's
got
the,
that from
that's
DOC.
it, okay, they've
They're
supplied that
gonna-
to us already.
Well, yeah. You know some of
Working on
them.
it. Okay,
You're
then-
working on it.
Well, that would just be good to inform my opinion, section 3 part of it.
I defer to my colleagues at the department.
We are involved in an interstate compact. too. Sean, James, and Troy, and Mary.
I don't want to sound snarky, but has anyone asked the guys in Mississippi if they like being there or not?
We've asked.
Yes.
And,
DOC is going to testify.
okay, and then the
Right.
second question is, it's down on page 5, line 17. What's the financial implication of that? Because last I checked, we don't really have all that checked in my code. So I'm just wondering how it's gonna, that's a great sentence, but
We're going to put you on the hot seat, Isaac.
like how,
Yeah.
like, you know,
Inhaling.
you're talking about like capacity at whatever it is, 500,000 or $1 million a bed or whatever. And I'm just wondering how that even happens.
And if, well, good question that again, will defer to my colleagues at the department. But if memory serves, I believe was it in the miscellaneous bill last year that there was a study specifically to analyze that question?
That's
Which
actually
question?
what that first person.
Your question about the expense.
Okay, that's all. I just want to know like what the financial implication is. That's all. Thanks.
We were originally told that it was lower for out of state.
Yes, my recollection is the same, that there was previous testimony that the cost per inmate to house out of state is less than they are in state.
36,210.
But the issue.
I have it memorized.
But the issue that we talked about was what would be needed in terms of expanding our own physical capacity to house them, to bring them back. Be needed. So there is a study that we put in language in last year's miscellaneous bill, corrections bill.
Yeah, H 876, I believe.
And the report back is going this fall, I think.
I believe so. I need to double check that.
It's the same date, November 15th.
And what would be?
That's going to be the same one.
That's what I was gonna mention.
Okay, because that's what I was.
They're technically separate, but how the department chooses to present it to the committee, I leave up to them.
So James and then Troy and Mary and then Con.
To quote a few good men, I have grave concerns. Is there any of the kind? But seriously, I'm kind of with Sean a little bit, but here's the thing. I realize that there's people who have a philosophy against private. Understand, have no problem here. I'm not gonna be Captain point to you. But I have a greater concern. What if they're not just more affordable? What if their services are better? I don't care who provides the services. I want good services, quality services, happy, productive, rehabilitative services, no matter who gives them. I care more about that. So I just want to throw that out. And by the way, I'm not judging whether or not they do or don't, I'm saying that's my concern.
No judgment taken.
Pick up on.
Troy, Mary, Connor.
No, I was just gonna mention the study. So.
And I think that's where I was as well, but I'm not sure if it's realistic, the July 1st, 2025. The commissioner shall neither negotiate nor execute contracts. Isn't that a little too quick before we can make some of those decisions? We may not even have a bill. Then the other question was the November 15th, if that was the same report. So I'm done.
Connor, then well,
Yeah, and I just want, this can often be a kind of an intense subject matter here. So I wanted to thank the vice chair. You know, if we just see it as a philosophical difference between us, I always find that helps, you know, the debate. And except for me, I've got really strong feelings about this. You know, I think we inherited the system. I don't think we need to continue it. You know, I think most of us were pretty disturbed hearing about some of the ICE stuff this morning here. Well, of course, Civic, the president, I just Googled it. When asked about like the deportations and rounding people up, says, I've worked at CoreCivic for 32 years, and this is truly one of the most exciting periods of my career with the company. Perhaps the most significant growth in our company in history over the next few years. I think it's below contempt. And just on a human level, having someone in our custody handed over to a private company with bottom line objectives who are not subject to public records requests or transparency that we have in state government. I know it's cheaper, and it's cheaper for a reason. And I think when you flesh it out, it's cheaper because we provide fewer services down there to folks. A lot of them do like it, Sean. And they like it because they get a video game system. It's a little more laid back. But you know what? Rehabilitation should be hard. It shouldn't be hard like a ball and chain kind of hard, but it should be hard doing the work to get you back to the point where you need to re-enter society here. And I think we send people out of state, but if we were to like do this for the same price and the same services, we could build a mega prison in Vermont with 1,000 beds and offer the same services, and we could do it dirt cheap, you know. But we don't do that because people would be disgusted. And I think they should be disgusted that we have this practice right now. So I agree with Mary, like maybe the time frame is too short on this, but I think we have to do it. And I don't think we're doing Vermonters any service by sending folks out of state. Companies are like, again, it's below contempt is the words I used. I think it's some of the worst of us, you know, that we're seeing just doing this. So I hope we can discontinue this practice.
Will,
So when we're talking about contracts as well, and this goes back to Mary's point about July 1st of 2025, our WellPath contract's up in spring of 26, correct?
I'm not familiar.
Would we-
go see.
When
Yeah.
is the WellPath? Okay.
Twenty-six.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this is my question, is that would be an example of something that would, you know, I don't mind saying this on camera. I don't think WellPath is probably the best option to go first, but we can't, to someone's point over here, we can't untangle ourselves from what we've created over decades of having a private healthcare contractor. So I guess my question would be, what would that offboarding process look like to do that? And then you said that we have a fiscal note on this having been done in previous years, correct? About what the cost would be to build more facilities.
I'm not sure about a fiscal note. I think there's been previous testimony from the department.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And that was in this committee, or was that a report that was?
No, it was, well, it's been in
It's been in this committee. It's been in justice oversight over the summer. I can't give you a specific answer though.
we've been talking for many years about how you build new facilities and what price tags could be.
I mean, if you're talking to women's is 90, right? So our height.
And Representative Greer, I think maybe this was a question embedded in your comment, but with the WellPath contract coming up in 26, you know, at that point, you know, so they wouldn't have to untangle before then. They just couldn't re-enter after. Because what this section B does for the transfer prohibitions is that it basically says after July 1st of this year, No new contracts.
So new contracts, but you can still
then-
renegotiate an
But
existing.
this is just
No.
for out of state.
You can neither negotiate nor execute contracts. So that would be a new contract that would be negotiated and executed after 2026. But 2030 is the deadline to terminate all contracts. So this one coming due in 26 would essentially be the final version of that contract.
Is it all contracts that would also include your medical contract or just contracts that pertain to out of state placements and private?
Facilities.
Yeah, that's what.
Facilities, not right.
It's it all.
Yeah, so, well, so that's the transfer prohibitions, right? Farther up, though, there's a facility prohibition.
So then when you go down to the transfer, that would imply more contracts beyond just the out-of-state bed contracts.
Right.
So it's any contracts that DOC may have, either
Well,
with,
this is related to just the, so yeah, subdivision 2 would be all to be compliant with the whole section.
shall terminate or amend any existing contracts to be compliant with this section.
And this section includes A1, that no one under the custody of the commissioner shall be supervised, housed, treated, or cared for
You know,
in
now,
and out of state unless it's operated. And then again, in subdivision 2, the department shall not employ any rehabilitative, educational, healthcare, or other support services provided by a private or for-profit entity. So
it's-
it would affect the contract.
would affect the healthcare contract.
Was that your intent?
Shooting for the stars.
Yeah.
Do you understand?
But just how it all interacts.
I just want to understand, that's all.
Maybe I'll land on the moon.
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to understand if that's what you meant.
That's why I'm.
So go back to number 2 on page 4. So would that also, well, it depends if we work on this bill or not.
Getting sense.
What other contracts do we have within our correctional world? That are services that are provided by a private entity?
Keith,
WellPath, what?
WellPath, commissary and telecommunications.
Are there any more though?
We can speak to that.
Okay, I think there's a few more. And would that also entail contracts when a person is out on furlough or parole and they're involved in programming that you may be contracting with a private entity? Would that also entail?
It could potentially include because the language here or other support services.
So this is what we do as a committee. Don't get all hung up here. This is what we do. We flag certain parts of language and take further testimony on it and decide, do we keep working on it? Do we change the language? Do we not work on it? I want folks to also remember, in terms of the out-of-state beds, placement of folks out-of-state beds for for-profit entities, we already have a report back that is due to come back to the legislature this coming November. That really deals with what the in-state capacity would need to be and what it would cost and how we go about to do that to bring the folks back.
Mhm.
So keep that in the back of your minds.
Reason.
Mary?
Well, Troy, love you dearly. And we're all, I think I could honestly say, and not to speak for my fellow members, I think we're all where you're at. However, it's how do we do this? We've watched the women's facility for how many years get kicked down the road? I want to do something realistic that we can actually do and do it well. And have the resources there to do the rehabilitation and everything else that our folks need so desperately. So I'm not speaking against it. I'm actually, I know this is going to sound hard, or I'm with you, but I'm not quite there yet because I'm not seeing a real path forward. And the time frame is a little challenging, even with these in it. So if we can think around that, those tough nuts to crack, then possibly I can be right there with you, but right now it's a little iffy.
I hear you.
Kevin?
This would indicate that we are unable to negotiate a lower cost or equal costs for the same services out of state than we provide in Vermont. Is that?
Potentially.
perception?
Potentially.
Potential, but that's what's implied by this, is that we cannot develop and manage out-of-state for-profit prisons that would meet our standards. The reason I ask is because if the legislation were successful at increasing the numbers of people that want to live in Vermont, let's just throw a number out, and we double the population, are we going to have space for that kind of rehabilitation? I don't like tying our hands if it's unnecessary. And it's unnecessary, in my opinion, if we can get the same service or maybe better for the same or lower cost without building more infrastructure, which is falling apart on us at this point. Aren't we boxing ourselves in? No, are we? It's a question. Are we boxing ourselves in unnecessarily, assuming that we can't manage the contract out of state?
I think that's a question for DOC, not so much for,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a possibility, as I answered before. What the implication is, I think that's, up to each individual to decide what they read between the lines. However, I just want to point to bill language here in the implementation plan that, if you were to have that population expansion and whatever, that this implementation plan doesn't just contemplate correctional facilities as the location of any individuals that might be repatriated to Vermont, for lack of a better term. It's also leveraging the other alternatives to incarceration, restorative justice approaches, pre and post-charge diversion, rehabilitative programming to achieve the capacity expansion. So what's contemplated in the bill itself is leveraging those other options to not just rely on correctional facilities to bring these people back to.
And that becomes a philosophical, can we do that or not?
That's a policy decision.
Aaron?
Well, to add on to that, and I was going to add on to it before we got into this discussion, where are we going to have the manpower to do these? I know in my community, most all of our agencies are pretty maxed out and can't get the qualified people to be doing the services that would be needed and the expert services that would be needed, not just someone kind of holding someone's hand. I mean, really helping through the best that we can provide folks needing help. And that's my concern as well, a little bit. That's got to be, however, if this goes forward, or when it goes forward as well, I should say, we've got to have a real plan in place.
There are other questions for Ben before we put DOC on the hot seat, and then after that, we'll hear from VSCA. And then we'll decide where we go. Anything else for Ben?
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. Ben.
Do you want me to leave this up and then I can be
It might be
sort of
helpful.
remote control?
It might be helpful.
That would be fun.
And then is it Isaac and Haley? You both coming up? You got a twofer. Well,
We've got 2 seats here.
2 empty seats. Come on up into the hot seats.
If I take your spots while you take mine? Right. Useful people.
Musical people.
And it's just so that you don't get in one of those out of state facilities.
Okay. So welcome you two.
Good afternoon.
So
Hello.
it's the first year you've been in the hot seat. This is what.
I think it is. It's a new perspective. Yeah.
From some jobs up.
Yeah. And what I want to start with, I'm, for the record, Isaac Dana, I'm the policy director at DOC.
I'm Haley Summer, the communications director at DOC.
Welcome. So
Thank
you
you.
heard some of the questions here.
We did.
And why don't you just start off on general testimony on the bill, and then you can get into some of the specific questions.
I mean, I think to start, to the representative's comment, Representative Morrissey, I fully agree with everything in this bill philosophically. In terms of, I think the values it puts forward are Vermont values, and I appreciate, I think, the spirit of the legislation. I think what you'll hear from my colleague, myself today is, how we operationalize that, what that might look like, particularly, I think, for the welfare of folks in custody. And as we'll speak about, as we think about moving folks back to Vermont, we just don't have the beds. And one of the worst things you can do in a correctional system is to overcrowd it. And I'm thinking specifically of the 2011 US Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Plata, which found that California was operating at 137.5% of its capacity. And that led to what the Supreme Court found was violations of the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment in terms of access to medical and mental health care. Today, we're at 135% of our general population bed capacity.
Does that include the folks out of state?
That does include the
If
folks.
you
If we
included
were to move everyone back, we have
It'd be
117 folks today in Mississippi. And if we were to move everyone back today, we would be at 135% of our general population beds. And I think
So I think that's real. It's 135%,
it should be in your binders. If you look through there, I think one of the first slides we
but
presented.
it's a general population
Yeah.
beds. And I think we need to really understand what that means. It's
Right.
not including your booking beds.
Right.
It's not including your infirmary beds. It's not including your specialized beds, whatever that may be. It could be closed custody.
Right.
It could be mental health beds,
Infirmary.
Mhm.
infirmary, booking. It's your general population that's basically your area that people are there for programming, but they don't have to have specialized services. So in a facility, you may have 170 beds. Out of those 170 beds, you may only have 100 general population beds. So when you're talking about beds, and I'm going to start hammering this because when you start thinking of replacing facilities, everybody gets hung up in bed counts and thinking that, oh my God, you got all these beds, you're going to fill them up. A lot of those beds are designated for specific use that are not used on a daily basis for general population. It's really important to understand bed usage. So it's 130, if we return the 117 folks, they're in general population beds category. We would be at 135% over capacity for our general population beds.
Yeah.
And for the committee's awareness today, there are 13 available beds system-wide
For general
for
population.
general population that we.
So system-wide, we have what, about 1,600 beds? 1,700?
I have to look.
Yeah.
I think it's around 1,600 to 1,700 beds system-wide. And we have about 900 of those, I believe, are general population beds. System-wide. I think it's around 900, maybe 800. It's not 1,000. It's 1,000. So that's why it's really important when we start talking about beds, what the beds are used for. And that's where the general public gets hung up, bed count.
And to that point, Chair, folks are oftentimes moving between different beds, right? Like their general population bed, their residential bed, but perhaps they're spending, a few nights in the infirmary, or someone is in segregation, or folks do move around the facility, but you do need that capacity to move them.
I think we've also heard testimony that our population is generally aging. So those special services beds are going to be utilized more and more would be the anticipation. So even though it may look like we have capacity there, that capacity is going to be sucked up in the near future. Year, 2 years, 3 years.
So this just lays the groundwork, but whenever we start talking about the women's facility for new facility. You may be talking about 50 beds, you may be talking 80 beds, you may be talking 100 beds, who knows what you're gonna be talking about, but for this committee, it is really important to understand the usage of those beds, because people will get hung up on the bed count.
Which,
And for us, we should not get hung up on the bed count. We should understand what the beds are gonna be used for.
well, it makes me ask, and I feel like you guys did cover this way back and I forgot. So if there's roughly, let's just say there's 800, general population, 900, doesn't matter. And then there's 1,600 overall, let's still say. What is the breakdown of that other, that's a lot of non-general population beds. What are those?
Yeah, we-
I know the category, but what's the biggest, what's the makeup of general?
Yeah, that might be, we had Josh come in last session and we went deep, Josh Rutherford, our deputy facilities director knows this with the back of his hand and can walk folks through all those different categories. So we can schedule that testimony again.
Every facility has booking.
Yeah.
That's,
Okay.
you're talking 5, 6, 8, every facility has that. Every facility has closed custody beds. Every facility has an infirmary, some facilities may have, more mental health beds
Mhm.
than others. Some facilities have geriatric beds
Mhm.
than others. So and we've got 6 facilities. So it's all,
Mhm.
doesn't take much to get up to that 600 bed level.
Almost half. So that's what made me just think, but I would love to hear from that, or even just, document that says,
Yeah, you can
for
follow.
my head to wrap around.
Mhm.
Maybe it would be good, Phil, to see if we could schedule in Josh to go through that, because I think it's really, really important to understand that groundwork. Because we'll have to work with our colleagues and advocates at some point to talk about size and bed counts of facilities for people to really understand it. So we've kind of gone off the track. So the beds that are used out of state, the general population beds. For that. Okay.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we can talk through some of the other aspects in terms of how this would impact us. One pretty significant concern that DOC has with the bill is restricting our ability to contract with private entities for rehabilitation and other services. So right now, all of our contracts are actually available on our website, but DOC holds about 73 contracts. This would impact a majority of them. And so some of those private contracts that we have right now are for services like commissary tablets, as Troy mentioned, also our health services, WellPath, certain trainings, as well as some statutorily required programming. So like sex offender treatment programs, I believe those are all private entities. So if this bill were to pass, DOC essentially would have to absorb all of those services. And that's not something the state currently has the capacity to do.
So the way that the language is written, and I brought this up with Ben, it implies that the contracting for services with a private or for-profit entity would also impact those folks who are on furlough and parole.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Not just the folks who are incarcerated.
Mhm. Yeah. So for example, we use an electronic health record or electronic medical record system. That service under this legislation would be canceled, be prohibited. I would wonder if you go to University of Vermont, they use Epic. That's a for-profit private company that operates their electronic medical records, the standard of care pretty much across the United States. So just as we think about these, we'd have to think about some of the implications for our system.
How about folks who are on the electronic monitoring bracelets? Is
That's a
that
private
private?
company.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's no nonprofit vendors for those types of
Yeah, we
services.
Yeah, we did
Yeah.
explore
We had that
that.
conversation last year.
Tried that.
It's in Senate Judiciary, we
Yeah.
spoke about that.
Tried that last year. Okay. Questions on this?
I mean, no, Haley's written a lot of notes here. I think there's also a question about if we restrict the use of private or for-profit facilities out of state, would we be able to move folks to public facilities? And indeed, we used to have hundreds of, I think 800 folks, 700 to 800 folks In various other states, Michigan, Kentucky, Tennessee, folks have moved through other state DOCs. And I would, defer the Defender General on this, but I think we've covered this in past sessions where we've talked about, whether the care, it seems like the care was perhaps not any better, or perhaps worse than the care folks have gotten at CoreCivic in Mississippi. And that also there's, I think, the difficulty that the state faces in losing the ability to enforce the Vermont standard of care when we send folks to other states.
Because if you send folks to other state in their own state-run
Right.
correctional facility or county-run facility, you're under their laws
Right.
and their requirements.
Yeah.
Where when you negotiate right now with a private for-profit entity, whether we agree with that or not, they have to abide, you negotiate the contract and they have to abide by our requirements as a state and our state laws.
Right. And that's really the reason we use a private facility, is so that we can use the contract as a vehicle to enforce the Vermont standard of care, our policies and procedures.
Mhm.
And our policies, which really are derived from statute.
Sorry.
So Joe, I was gonna ask you, I have a question.
I didn't mean to. So, and this may be more of a question for Ben, and I apologize. So would this also apply to subcontractors? So,
Oh, probably.
for example, I believe,
Well, so you'd have to look at it, yeah, you'd have to read it all together. So subsection A1, no individual under the custody of the commission.
Mhm.
So theoretically, yes.
so I,
Subdivision 2, the department itself shall not employ any educational, healthcare, rehabilitative or other support services.
so,
So there's a distinction between those two provisions.
but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there are paroled individuals who you contract with Pathways, who then often contract with private landlords.
I don't think it's necessarily, and this is a little bit out of my realm, but a contract as much as a grant. So we grant pathways to provide transitional housing. Yeah.
So then that practice would not be prohibited.
Yeah, I don't believe.
Yeah, I mean, because this is again, like, so you're looking at like housed, right? So pathways, this wouldn't necessarily affect pathways, but it would affect the individuals themselves.
How would it affect the individuals themselves?
Well, because if they're under the custody of the commissioner, no individual under the custody of the commissioner shall be supervised, housed, treated, cared for in an out-of-state correctional facility unless it's operated by a public or nonprofit entity to house individuals pursuant to an interstate contract. So no, it wouldn't affect like pathways, because are there people out of state that are subject to these grants and are being supervised that way? I guess that's a question that I have. Sorry.
Well, Pathways isn't a full profit, they're a
Yeah.
nonprofit.
They're a
Right.
nonprofit.
And folks on community supervision may be potentially out of state depending on their conditions, but we don't provide grants to any out of state entities
So it
for
wouldn't be
community
affected
housing.
in that case.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're Pathways, the contract with funds from that grant to a private landlord, that would not be considered a prohibition under H91 as it said.
I don't
Yeah.
think so.
And that's, something we could run by our general counsel's office. But I did really just, the last piece I wanted to turn to is something we've already covered, is page 5, thinking about the expansion of in-state capacity. And we need to expand.
So before you go there, on page 5, you've got the interstate compact or
Mhm.
federal contract. Can you bring the committee at least a broad scope in terms of, we're part of an interstate compact. Can you explain what that entails and why we use it and why we are on a interstate compact?
Absolutely. So with ICOT, the system by which we move individuals to other states, It's a minority of folks, relatively infrequently do we use that, but states sort of move folks between these jurisdictions. For example, in Vermont, we use it because we do not have any maximum security facilities in the state. So if we have someone who presents perhaps a very heightened risk of escape, or has a very high profile crime, some of those folks may be moved using the compact. So I think there was a press release maybe a few months ago, a very high profile crime. Someone was in the Kentucky system who passed away. And we report that just like we do with every death in custody. The person is still technically in the custody of the commissioner. But we do have a few of those folks housed in other states. But I think the last time I checked, it was roughly a dozen or so.
And do we get an exchange if we move?
Yes, it's a one-to-one
one of our
exchange.
folks to one of those facilities, we take one.
Right, that's correct.
So this language would not violate those compacts or federal contract. So what federal contracts do we have?
Well,
Not to get in depth on it.
yes.
At this point, but what federal contracts do we have?
I think the major populations that we house for the federal government, most importantly, would be folks who are facing federal trial in District of Vermont Court. So that would be a contract that we have with the United States Marshal Service. That's for 60 or so beds, although we often go a bit over that. They have about 3 times the number of folks, there's about almost 200 folks that are facing federal trial in Vermont. And those are mostly Vermonters. Those are people who are being charged with federal crimes. And then if you've read Ethan's article this morning or have been following, there's also folks who are being detained by Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
So for the federal marshal beds, for those folks who, like quite often, if we have a drug raid in Vermont, quite often your federal system is involved in that. So those folks will be charged on a federal crime to go to federal court, and our federal court's in Burlington or Rutland? Burlington.
Yes, so the U.S. Attorney's Office is in Burlington, but there's a smaller office in Rutland as well.
Right, so they would be charged on the federal level, they would be held on a bed that the federal marshals pay the state for. And those beds are up in St. Albans, usually.
Yes, mostly, yeah. Mhm.
We do have some in the women's facility too, the women. And they are held as detainees until they go to trial. If they're sentenced, they go off to a federal correctional facility.
Shoot,
They're
go to
not
the
housed here in Vermont.
Bureau of Prisons.
So that's your federal system. How much do we get from the marshals, per day, per bed?
It's 130 or 135 per diem.
And you're beyond that contract right now? You're housing more than what?
We're housing a little, yes, depending on the capacity in our system. Again, I think the U.S. Marshals would like us to house more folks for them because, as you can imagine, they're not utilizing, at least to my knowledge, WebEx. They are doing in-person trials. They're transporting everyone directly to a courthouse, a federal courthouse. And so those are sometimes very long trips from county level facilities in other states for the marshals. So it behooves them it's easier for them to have it here. Those folks lodge with us.
Yeah, Burlington. Yeah, we have federal court. Connor?
Yeah, I think we need to just talk about the concept at first and see if people are interested in movement without going too far into the language, because I think I know what Troy's intent is on this, and it's, not some of these other contracts. I think we could work that out. Feel free to say, Isaac, I got to run this up the chain if you want, but
I got to run it up the chain.
but so full confession, I started 20 years ago coming into this committee as an advocate, right?
Or do I remember that? Or a problem then?
She was mad at me then and she is now, but the commissioners then were coming in and saying, look, we want to get out of this business. We hate it as much as you guys do. We'll come up with a plan. And in fairness to DOC, we have reduced those numbers over the years. But I think I'm confused with, is the department's position at this point, we can't do it now, or we always want to have this at our disposal for flexibility in the session?
Yeah.
The distinction, it's like, is there some day where we can say, we're out of this game,
Mhm.
Because that's where I want to be. I want to be there, even if it means building some more beds in state. I hate that concept, but I'd rather them be in state than out of state. So I'd like to start talking about that stuff if that's the case.
No, I think, it's a good point, Representative. And I think, to that, unfortunately, DOC doesn't get to decide who comes into the door. And so I think we have, as outlined in Title 28, a responsibility to do so and to rehabilitate folks. And unfortunately, without having the ability to send people away, I think it's very difficult for us to plan without having the beds online at this current moment.
The question remains though, do you want to get out of the game, right? If it's been stated by commissioners for 20 years, to the representative's point, is there an appetite for evolving to a state? And maybe this is some of what the study's going to do.
Right.
What's the department's position on that?
But I
Do you
think,
like using out-of-state for-profit prisons?
well, I think, Representative, that's ultimately a policy decision for the legislature. And
Right.
we, and,
Right.
right, and it is our responsibility to administer the system that you give us.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, at this moment, if this were to become, take effect on passage, or let's say we had moved everyone back, we wouldn't be able to administer that system effectively. And then what you would have is overcrowding in facilities.
I get that. I understand that. And this is, right, there's a 2034 deadline in here. And yeah, there's contract, new contract deadlines that began on the 25th. And to Representative Casey's point, we can work that all out. But is there a benefit to stating through policy that we are not going to be a state who stays in this game, to use Connor's language? We are going to be a state that takes on the obligation of, if we're going to be a state that continues to use incarceration, and we are more and more of that state since I've been in this position, right? We create new felonies. We had one today that proposed new felonies. My contention is that we then take on an obligation as a state, and we are abdicating some of that obligation through our use of for-profit prisons. And we are allowing profit to be made off of the Vermonters that we incarcerate. That to me is what feels below contempt, right? So do we, and is there a policy avenue for stating Vermont doesn't do that? That's not how Vermont takes on the obligation of incarcerating the people we say we have determined need to be incarcerated. We keep them here. We keep them close to their lawyers. We keep them close to their families. That's my question here. Is there a way to do this, to outline that ambition, to outline that commitment to what we are going to be 10 years from now? That's what this tries to do. So that's to Connor's question, is there buy-in from the department to state that as a value statement, that we can see 10 years from now, not wanting to rely on shipping Vermonters to a for-profit facility in Mississippi or anywhere else?
I would just, no. I think it would be incredibly dangerous to make that statement without also targeting the reduction of the incarcerated population. I know that that's something that you feel passionate about, but we see very frequently, oftentimes, folks trying to limit DOC's ability to adequately serve the people that are remanded to our custody. We see this in conversations about the women's facility. Frankly, if we were to bring folks from out of state back to Vermont, it would be very challenging to house them in a dignified manner. But we don't see the same conversations to the same extent about upstream solutions and changing sentencing laws that would prevent people from being remanded to our custody. So I think it would be dangerous to make that statement without having other adequate mechanisms to ensure that we don't run into situations where we're using over 100 sled beds and people are sleeping on the floor and there's 3 people or even 4 in a 2-person cell, or even worse, they're in a gym.
Absolutely.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the study does ask that question, right? What else do we need other than facilities that would allow us to keep Vermont people in Vermont?
Right. And just to clarify, that is a study that is directed towards the judiciary. The judiciary is responsible, I believe, in 876. We made that change in
It
Senate
was you
judiciary.
all in collaboration
Originally,
with-
we're in consultation, but it
Yeah.
is with the judiciary because ultimately, as Senator Sears, the late Senator Sears decided, it's really the detainee question is a question for the courts. Again,
Detainee are taking up a lot of those beds.
right.
So it's.
500 of them.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, judiciary is the author of the report.
Right.
Gotcha.
And I think I was, just to go back to the text of the bill.
We have another question.
Sorry.
We do. It's a question-ish. So I understand that we would go back to the philosophy. It's fine. It's cool. But I look at other states' prisons for, because some places do call them prisons, you can call them corrections, whatever. And there are places I think everybody, all of us, would include, we would say, we don't want our people there. Some of them are probably run very well. Some of them probably have great services. But we've all probably seen something on TV where it has not been a great situation that would, Vermont would say, it's not where we want our people, right? And it'll probably be on the news as something bad happened. It wouldn't be something to be proud of. So you have that option, right? Because you could still go to a public, right? But I'm saying the public may not be better than the private is my whole point there. So that only leaves you one option, that's building. And whether we've been on this committee 1 year or a lot of years, we know there is no way in God's green earth we're building that capacity in 10 years in the state of Vermont. So I have questions about that to throw on the table to have that discussion. How are we going to take care of this? Do I think all 50 states, 49 states have horrible prison systems? Probably not. My point is though that there's probably some, and is Core Civic or any other organization better than some of them? I don't know the answer to that. I honestly, even with a study, probably will know unless I went to all of them, because I'm one of those weird guys that I need to see stuff and not just take people's word for it. But I don't have the money to go to all of them unless Connor has it. But anyways, my point is dude, I'm not sure.
Joe, he has another.
Right, Joe might have it. He found 6 cents today, so Joe's like, I'm just sitting
Couldn't
there.
resist.
Yeah.
Couldn't resist.
But anyway, I'm just like, to me, it's a way bigger issue than whether it's private or public. There's because you can have really crappy systems that are, there's a lot of things government does and they do it bad, and there's things that private does that they do well and vice versa. So it's a bigger question to me that isn't cut and dry. So I wish it was, but to me, it's not.
So any other questions on the interstate compact or federal contracts? That's where we were here.
But we got way off.
Okay. You had other concerns here.
Well, I think to Vice Chair's point, I just want to circle back on the bottom of page 5 about expanding in-state capacity. And I think we've already covered this. It's well trod, but just the difficulties that exist in trying to create more correctional capacity in Vermont in this moment. And I know there's also there's another bill, H 456, which is a prison moratorium bill from Representative Chino. I don't know if it's
Yeah, that one?
on the wall, but it is available. And
Judiciary.
it's a continuum of care. Anyway,
Maybe it went up to.
it might have gone upstairs, but that bill not only prohibits any kind of prison construction, it also prohibits any rehabilitation of existing facilities, any ongoing maintenance work. And I will note that there are several co-sponsors of that bill who are also co-sponsoring this bill. And so I started to think about some of the inconsistencies to Representative's point. I don't think any of them are in this committee, but the point being that I just want to illustrate the difficulties that the corrections system is sometimes, and to Haley's point as well, the crosshairs the correction sometimes finds itself in, differing pressures from the judiciary, pressures from legislation. And that is how we have ended up in this place to begin with.
Like all of our other major issues, affordability, education, drug addiction.
There's only one. Right, on both of them. Not.
Sean,
I guess I have to say this, I get what Representative Casey and Hedrick are getting at, and it's a real wonderful thought that I wish we had the money to do. I would love nothing more than to do that. But took the Northeast tour, Northeast Kingdom tour, and I was in a school up in the Northeast Kingdom that's probably not as nice as some of the, I don't know, I haven't been in the facilities yet, but we are so desperate to build schools for kids who have never done anything wrong in their whole lives. They've just been born and want to go to school and learn, and we can't even build schools for them. And I struggle with taking care of them because I feel they are the future. And if you've murdered someone, I have a hard time leveling that off. So I struggle with that, and I just needed to say that.
unfortunately, some folks are under state custody. And it's not just corrections, it's also mental health.
Mhm.
They're under state custody.
Yeah.
And if they're in the state hospital in Berlin or down at the retreat in state custody, there's responsibility of the state because they are under our custody. And I understand what you're saying about kids. I understand school construction. Believe me, I understand school construction. We lived it in this committee for many years.
I think we also find that some of the individuals in our system grew up in situations that were less fortunate and might have not had those same opportunities. I know Isaac and I were at Northwest in December at an acting class that CCV was teaching. And Isaac was actually talking to an individual, so you can probably tell it better than I can, but he was talking about his upbringing, and he had been kind of institutionalized his entire life, and he grew up in DCF custody. And unfortunately, folks in those circumstances oftentimes then find themselves in different areas of state custody, and in this case, it was corrections.
Yeah, you can look at the PRIN study, looking at the adverse childhood experiences who are in the commissioner's custody. 7, 8, 9 astronomical scores, a lot of childhood trauma, and that's the majority of folks in custody today.
And that kind of goes to Sean's point. And I don't know if this is his exact point, but it triggers my point, which is we already know. We invest in kids and we do things the right way for children. And it's not going to happen overnight. That's really the only way you have to change society is to really work with these kids who have had, and some of us have had, bad experiences childhood, and some escape and some don't. But you got to fix the issues with kids. So I understand where Sean's coming from not just that perspective, but just the investing in children. And I know there's other people who don't want to invest in children, but if we don't, you have more problems here. You have way more problems here. And it's mental health, it's education, there's a lot of other issues. I mean, I don't have to preach to you guys, but we deal with it every day. But
I think
That's what we have to balance out. That's what we balance out. That's the work of a legislative body. It's not always fun and games. Sometimes you do have to make some tough decisions that you think you're never going to have to make. And that's part of being a legislature. It's really tough. It's not an easy thing to balance. Huh?
Yeah, I mean, one point I would make is I find a discomfort with, we spent a lot of time with kids apart and looking to expand those options so that parents and facilities can have that time with their family. And yet we perpetuate a system where these people are hundreds of miles away, away from their families. And, a core piece of actually being rehabilitated is having that network, knowing that you can go home and you have somebody who cares about you and keeping that line of contact. And I think we deprive so many people of this by sending them out to Mississippi there. So it feels to me like it's out of sight, out of mind. And, and I'll admit, if the general public was really fuming about this, we would have done something already. but they're not. So I think as a society, you know, pushing people away into the shadows leaves us with discomfort if, you know, we don't really know what's happening down there. And again, I would say, like, hey, if it was cheaper to, you know, it would be cheaper to privatize our entire system in state, like other states have done. If you look at Tennessee, you know, they've got core civic prisons left and right. But I don't think it's acceptable to us when it's in our own, like, in front of us.
Well, and that, I was just talking to somebody the other day about this, and I think it's true. Even without privatizing the system, we could have a private entity build a correctional institution in a state far cheaper than we can build it, and have them lease it back to us that we operate. So there's other ways to save money, but it's also, to me, ridiculously sad that an outside entity could build something for cheaper than we can build it, and then we have to release it back. I mean, the idea that we can't do it because everything with state government costs more money. It's just a crazy system. It's crazy.
Sean and then Kevin.
I hear you. I get you. I have a question for you too. Is there any prisons that are closer in Massachusetts or New Hampshire or Maine or New York that these people could have, we could get them closer to their families? Is that an option? Even if it's more money, is that something that we could, so they could be closer? I know there's prisons, I drive by them in New York on 87, but I know that's maximum, so.
As I recall, we put out an RFP for this, and I think we had one response.
From Mississippi.
The place where folks are at now.
I didn't check from where?
From Core Civic, the Tallahatchie facility.
Tallahatchie.
We have reached out to the main facility. They've said no. We've reached out, we had a contract for a little bit at a county facility before your time, Isaac and Haley, down in Massachusetts. I think it was Franklin County. And we pulled them out of there pretty fast. I think it was 6 months, yeah. It's really bad. Other states just don't want to deal with it.
Mhm.
You know, we've reached out to New York State, we've reached out to New Hampshire. They don't want anything to do with it.
Other states also have staffing crises right now, so
We're in the same boat.
yeah, I think it'd be
You're
challenging for them to.
Yeah, right.
exactly.
And, you know, I will note, I think this came up that, you know, I would, if you're going to take further testimony on this, I would invite the Defender General to speak on this. I know we've talked about this in past sessions, in that, you know, speaking to prisoners' rights, they go and visit those folks. Our staff are down there all the time. The commissioner was just down a couple weeks ago. Many folks who are down there do report that they prefer being down there. The facility is much nicer. It is much more modern. It's much larger. It is much quieter because there are no detainees there. They're all sentenced. There's kind of a social contract. The commissioner has spoken about this. They also have, I believe, Xboxes. So it's a different environment. Not to say,
They used to be able to smoke. That was the big incentive
Yeah.
out of state because they.
Yeah. not that negates, you know, Representative Casey, your comments. I think those are very pertinent, but there are folks who do prefer to be at that facility. And I think the commissioner will say that sometimes he's walking around facilities and people are asking them if they can be transferred. That
Facilities here in Vermont. when he's
Yes,
walking
be
on.
transferred down to Tallahatchie.
One thing for me,
Kevin
Sorry.
has,
Yeah.
No, I just said, James, is look at UPS and FedEx versus our PO. I mean, private industry can do it for less expensive and with a lot more options in general. For some reason or other, we in government have a hard time competing with. Right.
James.
and, which I don't mind paying more if the quality's better, and I don't think it is. But now I forgot what I was gonna say.
So we'll go to Will and then you might.
Yeah.
Well, not to pick on Kevin's comment, but it
Go ahead.
actually, I think, illustrates the point that I'm at. And I agree with James that we have to evaluate the difference between the public and private contracts. And I looked at your list of 73 contracts. And well, one thing that's just odd to me, and I don't know if that would be covered by this, there's a lot of consultants and consulting groups in your contracts. Are those people, would they be subjected to these contract provisions?
Without looking at them, I couldn't say for certainty, but thinking of a few of the consultants that we currently work with, I believe that some of then
Yeah.
would certainly be.
You know, for example, we have a
included in this.
DEI consultant, Tabitha Moore, she's the former head of the NAACP in Rutland, who's great. Moss Group,
Yeah.
we'd have to look at some of them, but yeah, just training. Yeah, she's great.
Yeah, no, I was just curious with some of these contracts, and some of them are organizational
Mhm.
in the community. For example, I saw Addison and Bennington County Restorative Justice are part of your contracts. So that's good to see that breadth. And it would be nice, I guess, with this list, and it is outdated, it's over a year old, but if there, I think we said that you might be able to provide us a list of the ones that would be affected by this and the ones that wouldn't be.
James?
I remember. For me, if we're moving forward, if we have, not if, we do, have the report coming back, before I would advocate for moving forward on this, I want to, we commission something, I want to see it before we go and jump ahead of it. We do that a lot in this building. And I know for, having spoken to the commissioner, he said, we're welcome to go to any of the facilities, including Mississippi. And I got to figure out how I want, because I do want to see the facility. I've been in Northwest. I don't admire anybody that's not admire. Envy. That's what I meant to say. Thank you, Isaac, for being here. Anybody that has to be there, it's not the greatest place. Certainly, whether it's in incarcerated persons or the people who work there. But I think there's a lot of value for all of us. For anybody who hasn't been to one, you should be making plans to try to go see our facilities. I'm not advocating for everybody to Mississippi. I'm gonna figure out how to go. Even with that 2-hour drive. But I think it's worth at least the in-state stuff. People should see what's there, not just get a tour of what the structure looks like, but be able to get in with them to be able to talk to people that work there and inmates to be able to learn a little bit more about the system as we move forward in any of these bills. So
I appreciate that, Representative. And, to that point, what are we bringing these folks back to when it comes to the physical infrastructure that we have to operate as a system? Many facilities are over 50 years old, a lot of maintenance issues, as we've talked about, and it makes it very difficult for us to accomplish our mission, vision, values that we've articulated, but as well as our statutory obligations in Title 28. And what kind of environment does that create for our staff, our correctional officers who are working long, hard hours in these facilities? Again, I think we have a more obligation to update the infrastructure that we have to work with right now.
Do you have more to testify on this bill? Any other questions, comments before we move on to VSCA? Thank you, Isaac. Thank you, Haley.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Just have to go in 15 minutes.
Yep.
And then also just to clarify something I said before, I think it's been indicated from the department that this bill may affect certain contracts that based on committee's testimony, they may not want to be affected. If the bill does go forward, that's something that can't be addressed.
It's the work that we do. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Steve, I'm assuming it's you?
Yes.
That's all right. Try it. No, that's a problem. The institutional committee would have to build themselves a bigger room.
It's not us.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
I'll admit, I was visiting an education yesterday and I'm somewhat envious of the room. They put 2 committees in there.
it's nice.
Like what?
Because the room is 6 inches narrower than there, so
You actually measured the room?
yes, we do.
But we like watching the musical chairs.
Yeah, it's kind of fun, right? Good afternoon.
So if you could identify yourself for the record.
Sure, I'm Steve Howard. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont State Employees Association, and we represent the frontline workers in corrections. And I will say, I'll apologize. Our legislative chair, Leona Watt, who is a probation and parole supervisor in Brattleboro, is under the weather and unable to be here today. So I am a very poor substitute for Leona Watt, but I will try to fill in for her as best I can. VSEA supports H191, and we urge the committee to give it very serious consideration and to take all the due time that you need to in the committee process to improve the bill and to make it stronger. We start with the premise that we would anyway on all issues that you've heard me say this a million times. Nothing can happen in corrections until we solve the staffing crisis. That is the top urgent building on fire, has to have everybody's attention. I think everybody understands
That
that.
was going to be my question to you.
Yeah, that's the number one issue. We have to address the staffing crisis. There's no question about that. Having said that, our members support this bill because we believe it's a values question. We think that out-of-state, for-profit out-of-state entities are not consistent with the values of the people of Vermont. And we believe that some of the discussion you've had here today is an example of that. Having folks so far away does give the sense that they are sort of disappeared or forgotten. We were certainly surprised when the department had a choice between Rhode Island, a state facility in Rhode Island, and the facility in Mississippi, and they chose Mississippi. We didn't really weigh in on that because it wasn't really wasn't during the legislative session, and it also wasn't something that we were monitoring very closely. But we were surprised that at that time they chose a for-profit facility so far away from Vermont.
You know, if Rhode Island also placed a bid at the same time that Mississippi did?
I believe when Mississippi was first chosen, there was the two finalists were Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island, and CoreCivic. So I don't know if since then, sounds like they haven't participated in the RFP process since then. They certainly did at the outset of it. Ultimately, while we support the bill, the language of the bill that says nonprofit or state facility, our members' preference is that we have the folks who are incarcerated in a Vermont-owned public facility in Vermont. And sometimes in Representative Casey, I'm sure you might feel a little empathy that I'm in the same position you were often in front of the chair. Yeah, we often come to legislative committees. Our members come to legislative committees and say, "We told you so." We were very disappointed when the state of Vermont chose to close the Windsor facility while we had so many inmates out of state. We believe that was a mistake then. We think it's a mistake now. We think the Windsor facility should be reopened and that should be considered as part of this process. We have that facility. I don't know if anyone's ever been to that facility, but it's probably one of the nicer prisons. I mean, it needs some work now.
It's more.
Needs some updating. It's a beautiful site. I had the great pleasure of walking through that facility in a snowstorm at 5 a.m., trying to find the administrative building, and only to find myself in the middle of the laundry room where the folks who live there helped me walk across the campus to get to the place where I was supposed to be. I think they were more scared of me showing up than I was of them. But it's a beautiful facility. Vermont should reopen that facility and should really consider how that facility should be used, because it does seem like it might lend itself to a place where some of our older incarcerated population might find themselves. Right now, they're mostly at Springfield. One could argue that Springfield is overburdened with all of the things that we ask of that facility. And they are in the midst of the worst of the facilities in terms of staffing. So we do support the bill. We think it's a values question that Vermonters really would not support if they really thought carefully about it. Funding an out-of-state for-profit entity, particularly just given the environment we're in today and the role that for-profit prisons are playing in the immigration policy of the state, of the nation, and how that whole dynamic plays out. From our members' perspective, we think we should bring those folks home and that they should be really in a system that is based on Vermont values. The other thing that we also believe is, and I don't know if this can be part of this discussion, but we understand the value for the legislature and for the public of a unionized workforce. Unionized workforces can come to the legislature with the protections of state and federal law and their contract and tell the truth. And, you know, it's really important that legislators and the public and the press not get the sanitized version of what's happening in a state agency or in a 24/7 facility or in a correctional facility. And when you tour, as a legislator, I took many tours of state office buildings and state facilities. You get the sanitized view. You don't get the real view. But the employees can speak out. Many of you have sat with them and heard them speak out because they're protected by their contract. They're protected by the whistleblower statute. They're protected by federal law and concerted activity. So CoreCivic is not a unionized environment. So you don't hear from the employees there what's really happening because they'll get fired. In 2 seconds, they'll be fired. And so we would urge you to consider that as part of the equation as well. But we really would just urge you to take up the bill. And I think for the most part, those are the points that we wanted to make on the record.
Mayor?
I'm just going to reiterate again. I think all of us are there. It's how we get there.
Mhm.
And in a realistic time frame and fashion. And I'm not saying that to kick the can down the road, but we've got to have something in place that makes sense to get there and do it
Mhm.
right. Not only for those who are incarcerated, but for staff especially. And, you know, so that's where I'm at with this. And I'm really just challenged by, like I said, some of the dates in here and what some of the implications are. And that's not to say, oh, stop, or in a nice way say, I don't want it. Because we had the same discussion last year, Troy, and I'm there with you, but I don't see the other things that we should be doing in corrections moving forward either. So it's like have we broken the system at this point? I hope not. So we've got to get back to really having a plan in place to get this done. So
Yeah, we would certainly encourage you to take the time you need to do it right. You know, our members they often pay the price for legislation that is rushed through and not fully
Right, and
vetted.
that's
So we would encourage you to do that. I'd also encourage you, as long as you're on the tour of correctional facilities, to go see the Windsor facility. I mean, it does look a little, it's been lingering for quite some time, but just the environment itself lends itself to the philosophy that Vermonters, I think, have tried to espouse for their correctional facilities. And it's, to me, a tragedy that it's not an operating facility right now.
So thoughts, questions?
Alice, are you and I the only two who have seen that?
Right at 5 a.m. in the snowstorm.
Well,
It's very interesting.
I leaned over to Alice and I was like, I'd like to go see, you know.
It's beautiful.
We talked about it before, but.
I mean, it's not beautiful now, but the area is beautiful.
I get
Yeah,
you.
these buildings need to be torn down.
Yes, they do.
The housing unit really
Yeah.
needs to be.
It operated as a farm, and
Right.
and for a while it was the women's facility.
Yes.
And you know, I knew folks who were incarcerated there and the programs that they participated in. And I think, in fact, the chair may remember they came to the State House and testified about what their experience was at Windsor. It's certainly preferable to where they are now. So I encourage you to add that to your list and add that to your consideration, and also consider the value of not just a nonprofit and state-run facility, but ensuring that it's also a union facility.
Didn't Windsor say they didn't want a prison back there?
They don't want anything with Agency of Human Services. That's what the town manager said.
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
The Windsor and the town manager was pretty clear
Yeah.
that they didn't want any Agency of Human Services operations.
We've gone around that been several years on it.
Yeah, that's definitely the opening. That's often, I will say, I won't say it's always the opening bid of a community, but it's often the first bid that we don't want it here and there's no way we'd ever take it. And then suddenly a new sewer plant makes it a lot more interesting.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So while it's fresh, I want to take a break, but while it's fresh, I really would like some direction from the committee what the thoughts are. I know that there is a report coming back that we put in language last year because we dealt with some of this last year, trying to work our way out of state beds. There is a report that's due back in November. That will address particularly the capacity issues and initiatives that could be put in place to allow for the folks who are out of state to come back based on how we can address our capacity. What's the thought of members to continue working on this piece of legislation?
In the room, it seems pretty obvious.
I mean, my.
Are you on A, B, or C? You may be on C.
This is a D mine.
I need to see that report first.
Yeah, I feel like it's preemptive without having the capacity to focus on trying to put a timeline on something that, you know, if we revisit it in 2 years, we're gonna have to push out all the timelines again because we don't have the capacity. So it seems like there's other things that we could, I mean, I like the intent of it, I like the spirit of it, but if we don't have the place to bring them back to, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves on this one.
I could very reluctantly, I think, since the time frame is so long anyways, wait for that report with the caveat. For me anyways, I would feel a lot more comfortable if we kept talking about this, you know, even if it's not a bill form. For example,
Yeah.
we hear from WellPath, we hear from a lot of contractors.
Mhm.
I would like to have a chat with Core Civic this session if we could make that happen.
Come with me.
And
So I was gonna say.
a good road trip, actually.
Same
but,
if-
yeah.
I'll get on that committee with,
If we had time to keep the discussion going around, not around, but with all the other topics we have, I would appreciate that till we get the report, so.
Yep, I'd have a lot of questions for them. That's
Because I mean, there's a lot of other things to talk about without officially moving forward. I mean, again, I know I already said this, but for more members to go and see the I was gonna say institutions, jeez, God, my brain shut down
You're
today.
drinking too much.
I know. Too much Coke.
Too much Coke.
Coke Zero, by the way, you guys. But anyways, to go see the institutions and you know, talk to the workforce, talk to management, talk to there's a lot of different things to especially for newer members to get caught up on where we are, how they think we can get to where we need to be if you know, if philosophically we align with this bill. There's plenty of things to do without officially having it and then taking it up at the beginning of next session once we have the report to do in a more official way. I mean, that's my take, but I'll stop because I've said my take 3 times, I think. And it's, without asking permission, I can't speak a third. Oh crap, I went over it. It's only 3 times.
Other folks? I'm gonna go to Kevin first and then Troy.
Would you mind reminding me why the Windsor facility was closed?
Oh, boy.
You don't need to.
That could take a week.
No, it was,
Reader's Digest version.
hmm?
Reader's Digest
Yeah,
version.
it's gonna be Reader's Digest. I believe it was under Governor Shumlin, I believe. And it was a work camp at that point, and there weren't enough folks coming in that qualified for
Oh,
work.
okay.
Right.
Yeah. Not so-
Because it is a beautiful area.
I thought it was the women's facility.
It was.
Oh, so
They were moved up to St. Albans to make room for the work camp when we had more folks
Mhm.
qualified for the work camp.
Oh,
That was bad.
Because we had St. Jay was also a work
Gotcha.
camp with 100 beds. And then Windsor was converted because they had 100 beds to a work.
so it's a 2-step.
And then the women went up to St. Albans.
Or so, yeah, okay, got it. Thank you.
There was a lot of movement that happened in the late 2010, 2000, a lot of it. Sure.
Windsor is adamant that they don't want anything with human services. Nothing. I mean, we went around the bend on that.
Thank
See you,
you,
Ben.
Ben.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
We'll be
Ben.
back next
See you
week.
tomorrow, right? Or-
Awesome.
Oh, whatever.
We'll
I
look
Back tomorrow.
You don't know what day it is.
You'll be here when, you'll be here when you get here.
forward to it.
That's right. Till next time.
Till next time.
Thank you.
Troy.
Just to remind the committee that as we're sort of identifying this as a really tough lift, we have bills on the wall that we can still drastically improve the conditions right now. And I would suggest too, bills that might let us look at capacity as we look at, well, H32 for conditions, right? Improving the method by which we help folks transition through MOUD. 298, we can start having very real conversations about commissary pricing, predatory pricing, I would call them exploitive pricing. Look at things we can do right now to have a really significant impact on folks who are incarcerated. And I will remind us that as our incarcerated population feels better served, I am convinced that the folks who work in those facilities have an easier time of working with that population. And then I think there are capacity questions that we can be asking in and around our partnership with or the contracts that require us to work with federal detainees, not the market program necessarily, but certainly the ICE and Border Patrol. That is the state facility and the state resources being used to execute federal mandates, and that will have an impact, however small, on capacity. So I do think that there remain, even if we're letting this one rest, I'm not going to say let it go.
No.
There are things we can do right now to improve how we deliver our services to this population that this state has determined needs to be incarcerated. That's an obligation that I think we have to play
With other folks? Sean?
I applaud both of you because you have huge hearts and big and just wonderful ideals. And I want to be there with you. I'm me, Mr. Builder Boy with the money. And I keep going back to that, but I applaud your being able to step back on this and I'd be more than happy to help you with to help with those other things you were just talking about. Sure. And try to affect the things that we have the power to affect right now. So anyway, that's all I have to say.
So what I'm hearing, put this on hold, keep the conversation going in terms of initiatives we can do to make our current system work better, increase our capacity, and wait for the report to come back in November. Okay. So let's take a break. We still are going back with DOC because we have want to talk about I'll make sure that's titled because I know what it is in terms of recovery coaching and the earmark for dollars.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take a quick 10-minute break.
Still online.